Right. Wells Philosophy Group online meeting, 3rd of August, Civil Disobedience, a failing or a strength of democracy. There are 3 questions for today's session, one of definition, one of moral principle, and one of practice. What makes civil disobedience a distinct form of protest? When is it morally justified? And how should we respond to it? At whatever level you engage with philosophy, I hope you will find something of interest here. What is civil disobedience? Civil disobedience is historically significant. Acts of civil disobedience have forced society to reappraise its moral standards and the state to reassess its policies. It has changed attitudes as well as the law, so is an instrument of social change. And there is a widespread belief that such change represents progress. The United States writer Thoreau coined the term civil disobedience back in 1848 in explaining his earlier private refusal to pay the poll tax. He objected to his money being used to wage a colonial war on Mexico and to prosecute fugitive slaves. Progressive thinkers since have expanded and refined Thoreau's individual conscientious objection to paying his taxes in order to embrace the wider range of protests that have emerged over the last 100 years or so. The 20th century American liberal philosopher Rawls offers an example of a modern definition, which runs something like this: a conscientious breaking of the law that is concerted, public, non-violent, and undertaken with the objective of changing government policy. Thoreau's solitary and private gesture now appears somewhat sidelined. When identifying and comparing different forms of protest, Rawls uses a number of dichotomies. Examples include legal and illegal, violent and peaceful, harmful and harmless, public or private, individual or group, and so on. This simple technique is typical of analytical philosophy and is often exercised in discussing more complex concepts such as truth or beauty. Rawls's definition falls into 6 parts. I shall examine these one at a time. Number 1. Civil disobedience is an act of conscience and undertaken for a cause. In other words, it is a principled stand. Freedom, equality, transparency, accountability, these are familiar forms and relate to a human welfare generally. The sustainability of the environment and the welfare of animals are also issues that inspire civil disobedience, suggesting that causes relating to human welfare indirectly, or to a wider range of things we care deeply about, also count as suitable principles. I sense that Rawls seeks a certain high-mindedness in his definition here. I'm unsure if he wants to include small local issues such as opposing a library branch closure or agitating for the installation of a pedestrian crossing. Are these excluded as candidates for civil disobedience? If people feel strongly enough about them, they might easily be presented as exemplifying something very high-sounding. A library keeps a local community alive, or a pedestrian crossing protects children's lives. So what is unclear is the sort of scale on which to assess an issue to decide if it qualifies as a full-blown matter of principle or not. Part 2 of the definition, Rawls distances civil disobedience from insurrection. Civil disobedience's aim is to change government policy and target the law-making branch, that is the legislature. Rawls's definition rules out revolutionary confrontation. Civil disobedience only targets individual laws or failings within the system of government. But we will examine Gandhi's salt marches of 1930. Gandhi planned non-violent single-issue steps as a means of overthrowing the British rule in India. And other civil disobedience protests have pursued direct revolutionary aims. Examples include the Egyptian Revolution of 1919 and the popular movement to oust the East German Communist rule in 1989 to 1990. Is Rawls right to exclude these revolutionary movements from his definition, I wonder? Rawls appears to confine his focus to within democracies. Certainly, civil disobedience tends to be more widespread and effective in democratic societies. Public opinion there counts for more. In non-democratic societies, where there are powers of arbitrary arrest, powers of media suppression, and so on, the strategy is far more likely to fail. But what is the essential difference between the suffragette struggles for enfranchisement within a limited democracy, for instance, and movements resisting autocracies seeking any sort of franchise? Perhaps it is more cogent and consistent to argue as follows. To seek the overthrow of an autocracy that refuses the franchise to its subjects may qualify as civil disobedience, but to seek the overthrow of a democratic government of enfranchised citizens will not. Does civil disobedience exclusively target national governments? It seems not. Civil disobedience is often aimed at other major power brokers, such as local governments, multinational corporations, universities, and so on. Even when civil disobedience does target the state, it might be only indirectly. Hunt saboteurs or anti-factory farming activists, for instance, aim their actions directly against those whose practices they oppose. So Rawls' definition doesn't cover here a distinction between civil disobedience on the one side and intimidation or direct action on the other. Some campaigners attacked targeted individuals. For example, PETA animal rights protesters who, for example, have sprayed paint on those wearing fur coats. These actions aim to suppress an activity and change attitudes without necessarily seeking to change the law. Is direct action civil disobedience? Maybe yes, maybe no. Perhaps violence or threats of violence are the critical factors here. Part the third. Civil disobedience breaks the law. Civil disobedience differs from legal protests such as authorised peaceful demonstrations. Tactics of civil disobedience include trespass, damage to property, disruption of everyday life such as obstructing traffic or occupying premises. The aim is to maximise disruption and to maximise publicity using a minimum of means. Civil disobedience is distinct from flouting regulations or refusing to carry out contractual duties. Examples of these include police refusal to intervene to prevent criminal activity, armed forces mutinying, or judges refusing to sentence convicted criminals. These aren't always clear breaches of the law in themselves. Strikes, go-slows, and working to rule are other forms of non-cooperation or refusal. Normally, they aren't concerned with matters of conscience, but sometimes they promote some important principle, such as gender equality. Should these be considered civil disobedience actions, or must they involve occupations or other illegal activity before rules would allow them to qualify? Part 4 of the definition. Civil disobedience is non-violent. Both reactionaries and progressives agree that sustained or widespread violence is contrary to the idea of democratic government. Violence also risks undermining the cause and alienating potential supporters. Protests might get out of control, provoking state accusations of riot, leading to reprisals, and inciting an escalation into vandalism and looting. So Rawls is anxious to distance civil disobedience from rioting, even though, like civil disobedience, rioting may be limited to specific demands such as the poll tax abolition. The distinction becomes muddied if the police deliberately or not turn a protest into violent confrontation. Agents provocateurs may provoke violence in order to undermine the protesters' non-violent intentions. They know they can discredit protesters in this fashion, allowing the state to claim justification in responding more harshly. Part 5. Civil disobedience is public. Normally, civil disobedience activists don't attempt to conceal their actions or evade the legal consequences of them. Activists often submit to or even seek arrest. Well-publicised arrests may give added impetus to a movement, but of course at the cost of losing the active support of a valued member. organisers have learned the importance of making any arrests appear as outrageous or as high-handed as possible. Conspicuous martyrdom, in varying degrees, often advances a cause. Christianity's worldwide success owes much to its martyrs, for instance. Indeed, it owes everything to them if you include Christ himself as the first. Making civil disobedience public helps promote the cause, helps win support and recruit more activists. The media are often informed of planned civil disobedience activities, therefore. Openness helps protesters distance themselves from other self-interested criminal activity. It creates an opportunity for protesters to highlight the higher motives of their actions, the depth and the sincerity of their convictions. Being seen to act selflessly and for a principle attracts sympathy and support. Some actions, such as animal rights releases, are covert, however, but does their secrecy disqualify them as acts of civil disobedience? Or is their openness after the event sufficient to exonerate them? Part 6 of 6. Civil disobedience is concerted. Rawls elsewhere adds the condition for civil disobedience to be collective. He distinguishes it from individual conscientious objection. This covers all acts of individual non-compliance with direct personal legal demands, such as Thoreau and his poll tax. But presumably a mass movement resisting a mandatory military draft, for instance, becomes a concerted action and so becomes an act of civil disobedience. Now, is Rawls being too strict here? Two of the most prominent acts of individual protest in my lifetime were Rosa Parks' 1955 refusal to give up her seat on a bus to a white person and the 1989 lone protest of I think it was a student before a procession of tanks in China's Tiananmen Square. Now, are these not paradigm acts of civil disobedience? If there is a difference between these and Thoreau's protests, it might be that Thoreau's represents passive non-compliance, whereas Rosa Parks and the Chinese student were taking active initiatives against systematic racism or against an autocratic regime. But why should Rawls exclude lone protesters, and why should he deny them the indulgence that civil disobedience often enjoys? Without that indulgence, the solitary whistleblower, Julian Assange, for instance, they are automatically labelled common criminals and will suffer the full force of the law and worse in consequence. Now that's his 6-part definition. Now why does Rawls focus on civil disobedience and distinguish it from other forms of protest? Is this just another philosopher playing with words? Well, I think he has two possible replies he could make here. Firstly, Rawls sees civil disobedience as broadly positive as a force for change in society, and so he is implying by his definition we should single it out and handle it differently. And secondly, without a definition of civil disobedience, the state will find it far easier to condemn all protests as subversive and suppress them indiscriminately. So I think Rawls might argue that definitions and distinctions aren't mere wordplay, therefore. Indeed, they may change the course of history. When is civil disobedience justified? Rawls argues that justifiable civil disobedience is a mark of a healthy society prepared to resist, in an orderly fashion, the unresponsive, incompetent or high-handed in government. Civil disobedience is a sign of popular vigilance over the process of government and is justified as a social safety valve. One extreme camp opposed to Rawls consists of the reactionaries. They argue that acceding to civil disobedience amounts to capitulation. It is a sign of weak, irresponsible government. If governments only take serious notice of illegal actions attracting sensational media coverage that are widely publicised and provoke mass arrests, then its authority is jeopardised. Every campaigning group, no matter how small or localised its demands, will adopt civil disobedience tactics and hold the nation to ransom. For philosophers, Perhaps the best known anti-civil disobedience pronouncement comes from the 17th century thinker Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes maintained that the arbiter of moral value resides exclusively in the unimpeachable and absolute authority of the sovereign. Civil disobedience, therefore, is never justified. Subvert this important principle and anarchy, or Hobbes' famous state of nature, becomes unavoidable. Opposed to rules from the opposite extreme camp is Thoreau and the individualists. Thoreau's position owes something to John Locke, who argued we have a duty to obey the law only insofar as we consent to its rule. For both Thoreau and Locke, the individual conscience is sovereign and the ultimate arbiter of what is morally right. And for Thoreau at least, civil disobedience is always justified. There is no moral obligation to obey the law. So reactionaries argue that authority should be obeyed unconditionally, and authoritarians argue and presume that everyone to be a subject of a sovereign body. Individualists argue that we are citizens rather than subjects, and that the duties of the citizen extend beyond those of subject. They reject the obligation of blind obedience to authority in favour of government by consent. It is the individual conscience which should be obeyed unconditionally. Between the two extremes we find Rawls and what I shall call a conditional progressive position. This position recognises the authority of the state whilst accommodating respect for individual conscience. Rawls's dual compromise position insists, with the reactionaries, that morality possesses a social dimension that makes legitimate demands upon the individual. There are moral principles that justifiably override individual interests. However, as a concession to the individualists, Rawls locates moral principles in a collective conscience in which individuals participate. Conditional progressives therefore allow that governments are legitimate objects of scrutiny and that civil disobedience, subject to his conditions, on which he'll elaborate, has a role to play in expressing and exercising the collective conscience. Progressives locate a constant source of tension, therefore, within advanced democracies, between individual conscience and collective authority, between private citizens and public government. They see no objection to a dynamic system subject to stresses or tension, however. There is, for instance, tension built into the very idea of an electric motor, brought about by the opposed and alternating polarities of the electrical terminals inside. Suitably arranged and balanced, those opposing forces may be harnessed to produce a smooth-running and stable engine. Opposition or polarity need not imply instability. So, conditional progressives maintain that civil disobedience is justified, but only under certain conditions, when pursuing an important moral principle. First of all, that principle must be well-founded and the motivation genuine. Then, civil disobedience is justified provided all existing legal avenues have been exhausted. Civil disobedience is an option of last resort. There must be a reasonable chance of success, the consequences considered and weighed. This done, the chosen course and scale of the proposed action must be appropriate and proportionate. Planners of civil disobedience actions must consider these and other similar questions. To what extent will the action undermine respect for the law? How will it influence public opinion? Will the action cause greater harm than it is trying to prevent? Rawls supports civil disobedience largely for its successes. He believed liberal democracy to be desirable and that civil disobedience had won progressive victories within it, including female enfranchisement, the advancement of American civil rights, and the ending of apartheid. Rawls believed that civil disobedience that is both well-founded and sincere is morally justified, and so needs undergo only a few formalities to meet with his approval. But There are issues that attract enough ardent and sincere supporters to form influential civil disobedience campaigns whose moral sanction could be controversial. Examples include the United States pro-life movement and the French Yellow Vest protests which targeted fuel prices. Should we be so indulgent towards civil disobedience in these and possibly other cases? How should we deal with civil disobedience? Well, the reactionary or Hobbes answer is prosecute transgressors and, as one would, any other offender. The individualist or Thoreau's answer, tolerate transgressors, respond positively and actively encourage individual stands on conscience. Thirdly is the conditional progressive or rules answer. Civil disobedience is a distinct type of offence and warrants a different treatment. Sometimes this is more lenient and sometimes more severe. More lenient when the issue is a matter of principle, more severe when the action threatens the authority of the state. In other words, civil disobedience raises the stakes or ups the ante. Civil disobedience protesters stand to gain more than the normal legal channels have granted them, but they stand to lose more too. So when applying this conditional progressive perspective, it is important to determine the motive for the actions. We do something similar when we distinguish murder and manslaughter. Is the motive genuine and an important moral concern, or does the action seek the overthrow of a democratic government? Determining the motive influences the seriousness of the offence. With genuine acts of civil disobedience, the motivation for law-breaking may mitigate the offence, but not necessarily exonerate culprits who have perhaps endangered life or destroyed livelihoods. Where civil disobedience pursues subversive or more serious criminal acts, then the offence is exacerbated and the punishment should be more severe. Intentions and symbols become important in appraising the seriousness of an offence. Starting a small fire in a public place assumes a new significance, for instance, when it is the burning of a national flag before the world's television cameras. Within democracies, civil disobedience highlights shortcomings in its operations. Examples include unwillingness to act at all, delays in acting, or the protection of its own institutional interests. Genuine civil disobedience exposes shortcomings in the mechanisms of citizen participation. This is sometimes called the democratic deficit. An example occurs in the first-past-the-post constituency system, which makes it easier for regional issues but more difficult for issues of conscience to be raised and debated. Many feel very strongly about environmental issues, for instance, but being spread evenly throughout all constituencies find it more difficult to gain parliamentary representation than those seeking regional autonomy. Where governments and courts respond swiftly, impartially, flexibly and consistently to problems arising from the democratic deficit, conditional progressives believe that civil disobedience will strengthen a democracy. An afterthought on definitions. This being an exercise in analytical philosophy, I have spent much time on definitions. I believe definitions are important. They influence practical decision-making, and much hard-fought debate consists in one party striving to get its own definitions and labels adopted at the expense of a rival's. What interests me is what leads us to adopt one definition and reject another. By what right does Rawls introduce a new definition of civil disobedience, and by what token are we expected to accept it? There seem to be parallels here with the present discussion. We might take an authoritarian, an individualist, or a progressive view on definitions themselves. The authoritarian view would be that definitions are fixed and a priori, independent of the actual things or events that they are used to describe. The individualist perspective might be that definitions are a matter of personal choice. And the conditional progressive definition or conditional progressive take on this would be that definitions represent a dynamic balance between authority on the one side and the changing needs, outlooks, and interests of society on the other. Civil disobedience itself is a good example of a concept that is dynamic in this way. It is changing and developing within a society that is likewise undergoing transformation. Within this dynamic model, proposing a new definition introduces a new direction for practical decision-making. Whether it is adopted and acquires authority will depend upon the interests it serves and its efficacy in meeting them. So to what extent does Rawls frame his definitions to produce the conclusions that he desires? It looks like he believes it singles out in clear terms a form of protest which, if accorded special treatment, strengthens liberal democratic societies, enabling them to continue with and consolidate the progress they have already made. Now, this is just an afterthought which I will try to expand if any of you wish to engage with it. We come now to the case studies. The first of these is the suffragettes. This provides an example of a political elite that failed adequately to address a pressing moral issue. It devised compromises deliberately to divide those supporting wider suffrage. Proposals were engineered to generate procedural wrangles and take up parliamentary time so that a bill was lost when a general election was called. I've jotted down a few details. The Liberal government introduced the Conciliation Bill in 1910. This was drafted by a cross-party committee of MPs and offered limited enfranchisement for about 1 million women who owned property. The bill was passed and moved to the Lords, but shelved by an unsympathetic Liberal Prime Minister Asquith. The bill fell with the dissolution and the second election of 1910. It was then reintroduced as a private member's bill. The supporters of female suffrage remained divided, however. Lloyd George, for instance, objected that it would enfranchise largely Conservative voters. Nonetheless, the bill was passed. The government also promised some parliamentary time, a necessary condition for a private bill to become law. But the promise was not honoured. Instead, the government offered to introduce a bill to universalise male suffrage. Significantly, 40% of adult males still did not have the vote at this time. Alongside this, the government offered to allow female suffrage to be included as an amendment to the main bill. However, the Speaker ruled out any such amendment as too substantial a change to a main bill. So the government appeared to have manipulated procedures to scupper the progress of female suffrage. The main bill was also dropped. In 1912, the government reintroduced the Conciliation Bill, but this time it was narrowly defeated. Conservatives put party interest above tackling a pressing matter of principle and feared any extension of the suffrage. The Irish Party also withdrew support over procedural concerns, fearing the fate of a Home Rule Bill. The tactics of the suffragettes. In 1903, Emmeline Pankhurst led the breakaway Women's Social and Political Union from the moderate pressure group, the NUWSS. She organised more militant civil disobedience tactics. These included members chaining themselves to railings, setting fire to post boxes, the smashing of shopfront windows, the bombing and firing of empty buildings, including churches. In 1909, members attempted to storm Parliament. These were extreme tactics even by today's standards. Were these measures proportionate or appropriate? Or did they alienate public opinion? From 1909, imprisoned suffragettes began hunger strikes. Prisoner welfare was the responsibility of the prison authorities, and they responded by introducing forced feeding regimes. When this policy failed, the government brought in the 1913 Cat and Mouse Act, which permitted the temporary discharge of severely debilitated hunger strikers. In the same year, Emily Davidson became a prominent casualty of the campaign when she ran out in front of the King's Horse at the Epsom Derby and was trampled to death. The WSPU suspended its civil disobedience campaign in 1914 at the outbreak of war. Some contend that the suspension raised levels of support and helped bring limited suffrage to women in 1918. Had legal means in the end proved more effective than civil disobedience? Others contend that civil disobedience had secured the victory, but that the government had delayed implementation purely in order to appear not to have been forced to act and in order to appear not to have had its authority compromised. Could it be argued that more extreme acts of civil disobedience make it more difficult for governments to respond positively? Case study number 2, the Salt Marches. In 1930, the Indian National Congress, led by Mahatma Gandhi, led the Salt Marches in India. He had planned a 24-day march. His chosen target was the 1880s salt laws. These created a British-held monopoly in salt production that forced Indians to pay inflated prices for their salt, effectively imposing a regressive tax for an essential item that hit the poorest Indians. Gandhi's leadership exercised ingenuity in focusing upon a secondary issue that was a definite, attainable target which was universally despised. Claiming the moral high ground was an easy task for the INC, who could make the imposing British power appear ridiculous. The true target of the march was the Raj, the largely undemocratic British colonial regime in India. The march was groundbreaking insofar as it exploited the value of the emerging mass media in achieving their ends. Photographers and film crews carried publicity of events to the world. Making salt at various points en route could be seen as conspicuously and harmlessly defying the law and created advantageous photo opportunities. Both the march and the salt making were non-violent tactics, but plans were made well in advance for the likelihood of Gandhi's arrest. Indeed, mass arrests were hoped for, as was the expectation that the accretion of tens of thousands of prisoners would make India ungovernable. The march did have ulterior motives, which a declaration citing the ultimate end of independence made quite clear. Were the salt marches successful in attaining this ultimate end? The salt laws were abolished and political prisoners set free, but India had to wait 17 more years for independence. Case study number 3, the US anti-abortion protests. Both sides in the abortion debate are aware of the publicity value of language in characterising themselves as the pro-lifers against the pro-choicers. This issue continues to be very divisive in the United States, with a 2019 Gallup poll finding that 40% of American voters were pro-lifers, with very few abstainers. A sustained campaign has steadily introduced incremental restrictions on abortion since 1973. By 2011, 80 federal laws had been passed restricting abortion. Individual states have also added to the statute book. One notable, albeit failed attempt was in Texas in 2017 to have abortion classified as murder, allowing the death penalty to be invoked for women who underwent the operation. Pro-life tactics include an annual March for Life, silent life chains of placard holders, the blocking of entrances to clinics to force closure for a day or even permanently. In 1994, Bill Clinton introduced legislation making it a criminal act to obstruct, make it difficult or dangerous to gain access to property. This was effective legislation and all but eliminated the tactic. So until then, none of these tactics would appear to have been illegal. Other legal moves included the picketing of clinics, the offers of free counselling, the provision of alternatives to abortion, the distribution of copies of lawsuits filed against abortion clinics and their physicians. The aim here was to cast doubts upon the safety of the procedure. Some of the circulated literature has contained false medical claims concerning the risks to mental health or of developing breast cancer in having an abortion. Illegal tactics have included the targeting of abortion clinics in arson and bombing attacks. There have been violent confrontations that have included the murders or attempted murders of physicians. Defenders of the tactics cite justifiable homicide in order to justify their actions. Pro-lifers clearly feel they are acting sincerely and for a moral principle. But is this sufficient to justify their campaigns? When does picketing become intimidation or harassment? Has civil disobedience been responsible in bringing about the tightening of the laws restricting abortions? Or have these changes been brought about by the more usual lobbying channels? And have the changes been as effective as the law would suggest? The ratio of live births to abortions has remained at about 5-1 for several years. And every year, over 600,000 abortions continue to be performed in the US. With these issues in mind, I will end the talk now and hand it over to you for questions, contributions, and criticisms. Thank you very much.